Good afternoon, everyone. I think you can hear me. Good. Welcome to the celebration commemorating our 120th anniversary. This is a great day because exactly 120 years ago, one of our precursor medical schools was founded. Before I turn the program over to our keynote speaker, President Emeritus T. Michael Bolger, who's well known to all of us in the room, I'd like to share a few historical tidbits about our great institution. I'm sure Mike's oration is going to be fantastic, and if his contains some of these tidbits, his are probably more accurate than mine. But it was exactly 120 years ago today that what was then called the Wisconsin College of Physicians and Surgeons was founded. The first class of students had a total of 42 individuals with 22 faculty members. And the building itself was located at the corner of 25th and Walnut Streets in Milwaukee. 20 years later, the Wisconsin College of Physicians and Surgeons merged with the Milwaukee Medical College, which had already been integrated into Marquette in 1907 to become the Marquette University School of Medicine. Now I'm going to go off script here. When Flexner looked at all the U.S. and Canadian medical schools in 1910, his comment about the two medical schools in Milwaukee was that they had no redeeming features. I think that's changed, and in large part due to the great stewardship of Marquette that we enjoyed from 1913 through 1967. And you may recall that in January we did celebrate our first century collaboration with Marquette, so there's another tip of the hat to Marquette. Under their nurturing environment and financial support, we flourished for 54 years until we separated from Marquette in 1967. Initially, the freestanding medical school was renamed the Marquette School of Medicine, and in 1970, after some discussion, it was changed to the Medical College of Wisconsin to reflect our institution's new direction and commitment to the entire state of Wisconsin. I want to stress right now, since this is a difficult time for us, we haven't completed what has been a challenging budget process for us, just to remind everyone that in the past 120 years we've weathered many storms and always come out of it stronger for our efforts. And I'm not sure if Mike is going to touch on the transition from Marquette to independence, but if the community itself hadn't chipped in to help us make payroll, there wouldn't be a Medical College of Wisconsin. So we did have some tough times there. We've now grown to 5,500 employees, including 1,600 faculty members, have an enrollment of 810 medical students, making us one of the largest private medical schools in the country, and have 405 graduate students in an outstanding and diverse graduate school. We have hundreds of landmark research discoveries here, including the first scuba devices, functional magnetic resonance imaging, a new successful treatment for rabies infection in humans who have not yet been vaccinated, DNA sequencing to identify and treat rare diseases, and many other landmark events that are highlighted on our webpage. Our physical footprint has expanded. We're now one of 6 healthcare institutions here on the MRMC, not in small part due to the efforts of Mike Bolger, not only when he was president, but when he served as general counsel for the college. So this does provide me with a segue to introduce T. Michael Bolger, JD, President Emeritus and immediate past President of the Medical College of Wisconsin. During his nearly 20 years of service as President and CEO, MCW constructed about $200 million in new facilities and added 500,000 square feet to our physical plant. Mike was instrumental in creating the Graduate School of Biomedical Sciences and was a passionate advocate for that school. Under his presidency, MCW expanded its affiliations with Froedtert Hospital, Children's Hospital of Wisconsin, and the Zablocki VA Medical Center, our 3 primary hospital affiliations. Mike is a recognized national authority on healthcare law and was a partner in the law firm of Quarles and Brady's before being named president of the Medical College. I hate to say it, I have a Quarles and Brady baseball cap that I have out in my car, and I forgot to bring it in here to acknowledge Mike's past history. As I said, he served as general counsel to the Medical College, and he provided legal guidance that really helped create the Milwaukee Regional Medical Center in the 1970s. So, now that I've taken up half of his time, I will pass along to Mr. Bolger, and let me finish by wishing the Medical College of Wisconsin a very happy 120th birthday. Mike, you're on.
Well, President Raymond, thank you for that warm and generous introduction, and thank you for giving my speech. Let's all go to the party. The poet Goethe wrote a while ago, "If you have a dream, dare begin it, for boldness has genius, power, and magic in it." Think about that. If you have a dream, dare begin it, for boldness contains genius, power, and magic in it. Today I want to talk to you about dreams. A dream that became a reality. But before that, I want to contextualize it, because I think it is important always to get the context of what we're talking about. Now, many of you know that I'm an inveterate Irishman, and I like to punctuate my talks from time to time with Irish stories. So I'm going to tell you 3 short Irish stories which contextualize what I want to talk to you about this afternoon. The first has to do with Patrick, who is my protagonist in Ireland. And on this particular day, we find Patrick in church, and he's on his knees and he's praying. He said, "Oh, dear Lord," he says, "you got to let me win the Irish sweepstake. I've been a good Christian all my life. I gave 2 sons to the fatherhood and 2 daughters to the sisterhood. You got to let me win the Irish sweepstakes." And the next day, we find Patrick on his knees again, and he's praying, "Dear Lord, please let me win the Irish sweepstakes. I've lit every candle in the church today," and I prayed and prayed. And the next day, we find Patrick on his knees, and he's saying, "Oh, dear Lord, you've got to let me win the Irish sweepstakes. I'm so poor, I just can't stand it." And suddenly a voice comes out of the nave of the church, "Patrick, you've got to meet me halfway. Buy a ticket." It's important that you have a ticket. We'll talk about that. The second Irish story has to do with Patrick and Sean and Seamus, and they're at the wake of their dear friend Padgeen. And they're looking down at him with his arms crossed, and Sean turns to Seamus and says, "Seamus," he said, "when you're lying there with your arms crossed across your chest and your eyes closed, and you're breathing no more, what do you want them to be saying about you?" And he says, "I want them to be saying about me that I was a good father to me children and a good husband to me wife." "And you, Seamus, what do you want them to say about you?" And he says, "I want them to say about me that I was a great patriot and a loyal son of Ireland." "And Patrick, what do you want them to say about you?" And Patrick says, "Oh, well, I want them to say about me, glory be to God's a miracle, he's breathing again." So bringing something back from the brink of death. And the last story has to do with the Mother Superior in a little convent in Ireland who's passing away, and all the sisters in the convent are in the room with the dear Mother Superior. And one of the novices goes and gets a glass of warm milk and brings it in, and she puts it to Mother Superior's lips, and Mother Superior refuses it. One of the other sisters, though, that has been around the block a few times, takes the glass of warm milk, goes into the kitchen, pours half of it out, and fills up the cup with some Jameson that they've been saving for the Archbishop's visit, and goes in and gives Mother Superior a sip. Mother Superior takes a sip, and then she takes another one, and then another one, and then another one, until pretty soon the glass is gone. And she closes her eyes contentedly, and the little novice says, "Oh, Mother Superior, before you go to meet the Creator, is there any words of wisdom you'd pass on to us?" And Mother Superior says, "Well, yes, there is. Never sell that cow." So don't sell your birthright. I want to talk about those things in the context of medicine, the medical school, and what we ultimately stand for. What I want to talk about to you today has to do with the dream that many people had, and contextualizing that, we start with the history of medicine. Modern medicine in America, I believe, started in the month of April of 1865. And what happened in the month of April of 1865, all of you historians know exactly what happened. 2 incredible things that changed the course of history for the United States. And the 2 things that happened in April of 1865 is, the first was that General Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to Ulysses S. Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse and ended the Civil War, the Great War that consumed this nation for years and practically bled it dry, both of all its resources in capital and its resources in young men. And the second thing that happened was Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, changing the course of history in this country. But also something came out of the Civil War. What came out of the Civil War is 750,000 young men died in the Civil War, the most in the history of all our wars combined, starting with the Revolutionary War through the excursions in Iraq. More of our men died in the Civil War than in any other war. And what did they mostly die of? Over half of them died of sepsis from their wounds, not because of the bullets, but because of the infections that were caused by the deplorable standards of care in those eras. Surgeons in those areas didn't use rubber gloves. They had no rubber gloves. They used their hands when they conducted surgery, and they didn't wash their hands in between surgery. They didn't change their gowns in between surgeries. They didn't sterilize their equipment. Is it any wonder that sepsis was one of the great killers? But out of that arose people across the world who began to attack the idea of a purer form of surgical intervention. And two great occurrences happened in the history of medicine at that time. And the first was, of course, the use of anesthesia. For the first time, anesthetics were part and parcel of surgery. Up until that time, there were no use of anesthetics. As a matter of fact, for every compound fracture of the leg, the cause was determined to be followed up by surgery, which amputated the leg. And the ideal was to operate quickly. Why? Because there was no anesthetic. You know what the record was for an amputation of a leg? 17 seconds. That was the record. If a patient could hold on for 17 seconds, he was virtually free of his leg, but then the complications of infection. But with the birth of anesthetics and antiseptic over in Europe became wholesale in the United States and sent a whole new way of practicing medicine, particularly in surgery. Joseph Lister in England pioneered the use of antiseptics. We don't use antiseptic surgery much anymore. It's aseptic. But they used antiseptic, and what Dr. Lister did with his surgical suites was he gowned everybody and draped all the walls with carbolic acid. Now, if you were a surgeon, how would you like to conduct surgery dressed in gowns of carbolic acid? It's a little not conducive to good dermatologic procedures. But nonetheless, it cut down the infection and sepsis rate tremendously and created a new way of conducting surgery in the United States. The Mayo Clinic was formed in 1889, and it heartily embraced the new surgical techniques, as did Johns Hopkins. And what happened else in medicine, which became part and parcel of the new way of doing things and the new way of looking at things? Well, I'm going to run through some very quickly and then get on to the history of the college as it relates to the context. As I said, in 1796, Edward Jenner developed the way in which we vaccinate people. And vaccine was developed from cowpox to provide antibodies for milkmaids who never got smallpox. And so he determined that if he could expose the body to smallpox in a inert fashion, he could create a positive way of treating. And the reason it was called vaccine is vacca is the Latin word for cow. and the vaccine became the way of treating some diseases. As I said, Joseph Lister in 1867 developed the antiseptic theory of surgery. Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch in 1878 developed the germ theory of medicine. Up until that time, the medicine didn't have a clue as to why disease was prevalent and was causing. Some of it thought it was the miasmic use of air, that the night air was bad, and so they enclosed beds with drapes to keep the bad air out. Others thought it was humors and an imbalance of humors, and one of the leading techniques was bleeding patients. As a matter of fact, there's some very good evidence that George Washington probably exsanguinated, because every physician in America came to Mount Vernon when he got sick, and every one of them that examined him bled him. And so it is possible that he just lost so much blood through the bleeding that he passed on. But that's not been proven, of course. Röntgen developed X-rays in 1898, and Felix Hoffmann developed the first real wonder drug. The first real wonder drug was developed in Germany by Bayer and is called aspirin. And aspirin really is a wonder drug at that time, because it was the first time that they had in a solid, stable state an analgesic that also was able to thin blood and preventive against heart problems. Insulin was used in 1922 for the first time, and the first vaccine for TB was developed in 1927. In 1928, Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin and provided the other wonder drugs as they began to come down the pipe. Dr. Waxman developed streptomycin in 1943, just in time for World War II. Now, World War II was another great cataclysmic event in American history. December 7th of 1941 was a turning point. And up until that time, penicillin was not really mass marketed. But once the United States got into the war, they developed mass marketing for penicillin, and it became a very common use for the ways in which it was treated on the battlefields. In 1945, the first vaccine for flu was developed. In 1953, James Watson and Francis Crick described the DNA molecule, and some think Rosalind Franklin got there before they did, but that has not been determined either. 55, Jonas Salk with the first polio vaccine. 62, Albert Sabin develops the first oral polio vaccine. 1978, the first test tube baby is created. 1983, the HIV virus was identified. In 1998, Dolly was cloned, so permitting cloning. 2007, human skin cells were developed into embryonic stem cells. And in 2001 to 2003, Collins and Ventnor developed the Human Genome Project, and we go into the modern era. The reason I bring those things to your attention is while all of that was happening, there was a dream that was emerging in Milwaukee. And the dream was started by 22 physicians to create a medical school here in Milwaukee. There were 3 major cities in America that did not have an academic medical center at the time. And the 3 major cities are those cities that have over 500,000 population. And the 3 cities were Phoenix, Arizona, Jacksonville, Florida, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And Milwaukee felt that it needed to have an academic medical center. And an academic medical center was determined to be a hospital-based practice developed by a medical school. And so these 22 people formed the Wisconsin College of Physicians and Surgeons. It became the first faculty. It was flawed from the beginning because they had it as a proprietary, for-profit medical school, and so it was viewed by many as just looking out for the best interests in the pocketbooks of the initial investors. In 1894, the Milwaukee College of Medicine was formed, and as Dr. Raymond pointed out, one of the reasons why Marquette was so anxious to get the Milwaukee Medical College on board was it had a pretty good football team. And they thought that if they could add it to their football team, they could go to the Cotton Bowl, which eventually they did. But the schools needed some place to operate. And so other visionaries stepped to the fore, starting with Milwaukee County. This is the original county grounds back in the late 1900s. There's the county hospital as it currently exists. Existed then, and this is the really the mental health center where we called it at that time the insane asylum. That's no longer politically correct. And over here were other buildings connected with the county, but this was the old Foley farm. Dr. Foley donated all this farmland to the county to build the hospital and an academic medical center. And the colleges tried to collaborate with the Milwaukee County to provide not only education to its medical students and its residents, but also to care for the sick and particularly the poor. And that's what became part and parcel of the Milwaukee County Medical Center. Now, as Dr. Raymond pointed out, in 1910, Abraham Flexner came through town when he was going to do his report back to the Carnegie Institute that funded him, and he asked for a report on medical education in America, and he came back with a scathing indictment of medical education in America. He said it was overpriced, it was access to few, and the quality was uneven at best. And he had very little but scorn for the two medical schools in Milwaukee. And this forced a great many schools to close or merge, as the Wisconsin College of Physicians and Surgeons did with the Milwaukee College of Medicine, to become the Marquette University School of Medicine. And the reason why they did that is because Abraham Flexner was in love with Johns Hopkins. And he wanted to create every medical school in America to be along the model of Johns Hopkins. And he thought that what Johns Hopkins brought to the table was rigorous academic performance. And so he determined that young men and women who were going to go into medical school had to have some baccalaureate education in addition to going into the medical school and becoming scientifically oriented. And the merger of Marquette, this is the Wisconsin College of Physicians and Surgeons building that existed back then, and this is the Milwaukee College of Medicine with the medical students on the steps of the building. And this was the county hospital where they practiced their medicine and medical skills. And it was a lovely setting out where we're sitting right now. The county hospital is no more. It was not a very good building. It was a single corridor building for, I think, 12 stories. And there were rooms on either side of that corridor, but that was it. It was not a very efficient hospital, and it was very costly to run. But again, the county stepped up to the fore and made this happen. The school then moved into the Kramer Building in 1932. The Kramer Building was a building that was provided to Marquette University by Mr. and Mrs., or by principally Harriet Kramer, the widow of a publisher of one of the evening newspapers. You can see the vintage cars parked along the street. They'd be worth a fortune today. But there are the students with the piles of snow going into the Kramer Building. for their work, which they did. You'll notice it's all male. It's pretty pale, and they're all dressed in coats and ties. That was de rigueur back then. So the school entered into a profound program of creativity and worthwhile endeavor. Now we reach the time of 1967, which Dr. Raymond referenced. In 1967, Marquette University had a crisis, and this is where I came on the scene. In 1967, I was a Jesuit scholastic teaching philosophy at Marquette University, living in the Jesuit residence at Marquette University, and the president of Marquette at that time was Father John P. Rayner. And I can remember Father Rayner coming to dinner one night and sitting down across the table from me and saying, "I just had a gut-wrenching decision to make." And I said, "What was that, Father?" And he said, "I just determined that I have to let the medical school go." And he spun out for me why. He said, "The reason is they're operating at a deficit of about $1.3 million a year that the university has to cover, and we can't cover that out of tuition from liberal arts students to cover it. And I went to the state, and the state is not going to give me any money as a subsidy because we're a Catholic university. And the separation of church and state in the Constitution prohibits them, in their judgment, from doing so. And so the only thing I know what we can do is to terminate our sponsorship of the medical school and let the medical school go its own way." And that's what happened in 1967. In 1970, the school renamed itself from the Marquette School of Medicine to the Medical College of Wisconsin. And it was that time in 1967 that other visionaries bought into the dream of a great academic medical center in Milwaukee. They bought into the dream because they were convinced that this was the right thing to do. There were men like Joe Heil, president of the Heil Company, Ed Fitzgerald, who was president of Northwestern Mutual Life. There was George Caston from the First Wisconsin Bank, Carl Wilson from Robert W. Baird, Tiny Rader from Alan Bradley, Ted Smith from A.O. Smith. They all began to coalesce. Louis Quarles from Quarles and Brady, who, by the way, became the first president of the Medical College of Wisconsin when it was launched as MCW. All of these men, they were primarily men, got together and determined that we were going to have an academic medical center. And Bob Eline, for example, of the Eline family, which owned Schlitz, determined that there should be a great council called the MCW Council, which would help to support the medical school going forward. They literally rescued the medical school from death, because when Marquette terminated its relationship, it also took the endowment of the school, which was about $3 million at the time, to help offset the deficits that they had supported over the years. So the medical school was really left on the street, naked, blind, and cold. And the mothers and fathers of this community determined that it was going to be saved, and they saved it. And it went forward. And there was another visionary who bought into the dream, one that was very important, and that was John Doyne. John Doyne was the then county executive, and a very popular county executive with Milwaukeeans. And he said to them, he said, "I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I've got this land out here in the county grounds. You can have it for $1 a year. Just build me a great academic medical center, and I'll help push it through." And so we began, and this is where I came in at another stage. I had left the Jesuit order in 1968 and went to Northwestern Law School, graduating in 1971, and lo and behold, my first job was with Quarles and Brady, and my very first client was the medical school. I spent 20 years representing the medical school before I became president. And so I fought through all the battles that we had, and I have to tell you, there were two people in particular who led the charge to get the county to approve a master lease for the medical school, and those two people were Rudy Schenecker, who was the executive director of the Greater Milwaukee Committee, and Chas Mulcahy, who was a local lawyer who happened to be a supervisor of the county board. And those two gentlemen began to pound the county board to get this through, because the county board was not all enamored with the idea of the medical school taking over all this land for $1 a year. But there was no other way that this could prosper and work unless the land was given at a rate that did not cripple the members that were going to move out here, because they wanted to move Freighter, which didn't exist. Freighter only existed on paper at that time. And they had a gentleman who was in charge of Freighter by the name of Dean Rowell, who tried to shepherd Freighter through. And now Freighter had some difficulties because, contrary to what a lot of people believe, because I've read the will of Curtis Freighter from stem to stern, because I had to defend them in a manner. And what Curtis Freighter said in his will was, I want a primary acute care hospital built with preference for Lutherans. Well, at that time there was a certificate of need law in Wisconsin. The certificate of need meant you can't do any building unless the state determines that there's a need for it, and if you have too many beds in an area, there's not a need for a new hospital. Well, they felt there were too many primary acute care beds, and they were going to refuse the certificate for Freighter Hospital, and if that happened, this whole thing was going to go up in smoke. And so we determined at that time that the best thing for Freighter to do was to become a full teaching hospital and have tertiary beds, because we could make a pitch to the state that there were not enough tertiary care beds in southeastern Wisconsin, and the state bought it, granted the certificate, and we were launched. In 1972, we started negotiating the master lease, and there was two gentlemen on the other side that really helped push this through, and that was John Peterson, who was the medical director at the county hospital, and Bill O'Donnell, who was the supervisor who later became county executive when John Doyne passed away. And with those two gentlemen pushing, and John Doyne at the top pushing as hard as he could, and Rudy Schenecker and Chas Mulcahy pushing through from the bottom, and all of the mothers and fathers that I talked about, the movers and shakers in town, buying into this dream of creating an academic medical center of finest proportions, became a reality. And in 1976, the master lease was signed. Now, think about that. We started negotiating the master lease in 1972, and it didn't get signed until 76. So you can imagine the blood that was left on the floor as we negotiated this. This was one of the most difficult negotiations I have ever been in, or I have ever seen. It was 4 grueling years of my turn to curtsy and your turn to bow. But we got it done. And in 1976, construction started. And in 1978, the Medical College of Wisconsin moved to its new building. This was the medical education building back in 1978. You can see the Health Research Center isn't here yet. That's going to go right here. The TBRC, the Translational Biomedical Research Center, isn't here. It was a bare bones building. There was only 3 floors at the time. Subsequently, we added the 4th floor, but because we had initially determined that the building could take 4 floors, but we only built 3 to start. But this became the focal point of a new academic medical center in the United States. It became the center, there is the medical school, of this great academic center. There's the Eye Institute, the county grounds. Freighter is, Children's is right here. Freighter's over here. You can see that it's beginning to shape up as the medical center that we now have. But at the time, the cranes never less. We always kidded that the national bird of the medical center was the crane, because the building crane was here completely. But then we built the Health Research Center, which changed a great deal of the school, gave us a new front door. We built the TBRC, the Translational and Biomedical Research Center, and became a true academic Medical Center. As I said, there were lots of heroes on the way, and what I have to say is I am awed, completely awed, at how many people in this town bought into the dream that was started so long ago in 1913, 1967, 1970, and on to the present time. It's amazing. It's amazing that it happened, but it did. And Phoenix and Jacksonville still don't have an academic medical center. But Milwaukee does. Milwaukee answered the call and came to do something about it. But the thing that I like best about this school is not the buildings, not the county grounds, it's the people. The people here is what makes it great. Our faculty caring for patients with compassion, with skill, and with love. We even have a young Jim Euchre. It's a good picture. But Jim it can be revealed now. People always ask me how I became president of the medical school. And I always tell them that a group of faculty came to see me and asked me if I would consider being a candidate. And that's true. And one of those faculty was Jim Euchre. So you can blame him, because he really did put the idea in my head. And all the rest is history, Jim. It was great. Carice Habeck, she was the leader of our graduate program. And in 1995, after Carice moved on, I started the graduate school. And Bill Hendy was its first dean, and now Ravi Misra is dean, following in those footsteps and carrying on brilliantly, creating a great graduate school of education. Bruce Comita at the Mac Fund Research Center, caring for patients, children who have been diagnosed with cancer. And this young man that he's taking care of right here, I've been told, just recently went on and joined the Marines. And he's off fighting for our country. Elliot Stein, who is now with the National Drug Institute at the National Institutes of Health. Doug Evans and Dr. Campbell and surgery. We have one of the best surgery programs in America, and one of the reasons is Stu Wilson sitting here today. We've had some wonderful people in this medical school. We've been blessed. So what does this all come to? What is the context? We've talked about how we are a great medical school, how we grew, what we've accomplished over the years. And that's true, every bit of it. But the thing that means the most to me is our view of the past with Dr. Lennon, who helped us create this medical school, both as dean and as president, with Sally Twining, who has helped develop our research protocols and programs, with our caring for patients and having our students have hand-on experience taking care of patients, with John McLaughlin, who was the head of the Mac Fund, who along with Dr. Lennon created the Mac Fund Research Center, with Sam Larson, who created a great program in neurosurgery where there was none, and Karen Blindauer, who is in our Department of Neurology and cares for very sick patients with Parkinson's, including me. And of course, Howard Jacob. We would be remiss if we didn't talk about Howard and his work in genetics and what he's brought to this campus and this school. And Dr. Kirshner, who is now dean of the school and is leading the charge under Dr. Raymond's leadership of doing something which I think is absolutely, totally worthwhile and necessary. and that's creating extensions of our campus. When I was inaugurated as president of this school many years ago, I gave a speech where I said I wanted the Medical College of Wisconsin to become a college without walls. I wanted it to be a college without walls that would reach out, that would collaborate, that would work with other healthcare professionals to provide something that is greater than the sum of its parts. And Dr. Raymond has figured that out, and I'll forever be grateful to him for his buying into the dream of creating a great academic medical center that reaches out to the boundaries of the state and perhaps beyond. And Dr. Kirshner is going to be a leader of the academic efforts to continue to create a great medical school. And finally, the thing that moves me the most is what Hippocrates said many years ago. And I found this quote and had it put up as a banner in the lobby, because I think this is what we stand for. Wherever the art of medicine is loved, there also is love of humanity. Hippocrates was born in 460 BC, 460 years before the birth of Christ or the beginning of the Common Era. And he wrote that. Wherever the art of medicine is loved, there also is love of humanity. We can provide the best science that medical education can provide in this country and in this world. We can provide the clinical skills to develop the art of medicine so patients can get a precise history and physical and examination and prognosis and diagnosis. But if we ever lose our humanity, we've lost everything. We put up a statue or a sculpture, not a statue, a sculpture in the front of our school. And Jim Myford, the sculptor, brought it and installed it, and he hadn't named it. And so I asked him, I said, could I have the students name it? And he said, sure, that would be kind of fun. And so we had a contest among the student body. And I'm no fool. I know that medical students have great wit and are somewhat iconoclastic and a bit perhaps jaded from time to time. So I knew I was going to get some answers that were not all that I would have liked. But I'm no fool, because I said that the winning entrant would get an all-expense-paid dinner for 4 at Sanford's restaurant. So I got some very good answers, and I didn't judge them. I let the students judge, and they judged that this young woman from California won the prize, because in her winning essay she wrote that in every patient encounter there are 3 hands at work: the hand of the physician, the hand of the patient, and the hand of God. And I think that young woman learned the lesson that this medical school tries to teach. Learn the lesson that it is important to never lose your humanity. And those sculptor has named the hands of humanity. And I hope everybody that comes through this door remembers that. And so on the 120th anniversary of the founding of this school, and the 100th anniversary of the connection with Marquette University, which rescued it once, and the occasion of having it rescued again by Milwaukee County and the movers and shakers in this community, this school has become not only resilient, but one of the truly great academic medical centers in America. And as far as I can tell, Patrick would have loved it. And I ask you all to buy the ticket, buy into the dream. I ask you all to help it when it's in its death throes. And I ask you all to never throw away the birthright that we've gotten. It's a great and good America. It's a great and good